She just wanted to deposit a check. An ordinary day, a simple transaction. But the cashier suspected fraud and called the police. Within minutes, the woman, Chuck Norris's wife, was harshly arrested in front of everyone. However, when the bank doors opened and her husband walked in, everything changed. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where in the world you're watching from. Morning light spilled gently through the curtains of the Norris Ranch house outside Dallas, painting soft gold over the oak table where Gina Norris sat with a steaming mug of coffee. The scent of cinnamon and roasted beans mixed with the faint hum of cicadas outside. She had always loved these early hours, before the world started moving too fast, before phones began ringing and decisions had to be made. Today was supposed to be a simple day, a short drive into town, a stop at the bank, and a meeting with the local Veterans Council about the new rehabilitation center that she and her husband were funding. The check lay on the table beside her planner. $480,000, a combination of donations and personal funds, carefully compiled over months. The money would become the foundation for a Veterans Tech Training Center, an idea that had grown out of countless conversations she and Chuck had shared with old service members who struggled to rebuild their lives after deployment. Chuck had often said that true service didn't end with discharge. It began again when a soldier helped another stand back up. She smiled faintly, remembering his words as she folded the check into a cream envelope and placed it in her purse. Upstairs, the shower ran. Chuck was home between appearances, teaching self-defense courses to young recruits, recording short messages for charity, doing what he'd always done, filling the silence with purpose. Gina grabbed her keys, left a note on the counter that she'd be back before lunch, and stepped into the warmth of the Texas morning. The drive into town was peaceful, the road framed by stretches of dry grass and the occasional flutter of dust as trucks passed. A local radio station played a mix of country songs and small-town news. She sang along absently, her mind already turning to the meeting ahead. By the time she reached Lone Star Savings Bank, she felt calm, centered, ready. The lobby greeted her with polished marble floors and a sterile chill from overworked air conditioners. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A man in a cowboy hat filled out a form at one of the writing stands, and a young mother rocked a baby stroller near the entrance. The ordinary rhythm of life surrounded her, familiar and harmless. She joined the line and waited patiently. When it was her turn, she approached the counter with a polite smile. The teller was a young woman, early 20s, with careful makeup and a nervous glance that flickered over the check when Gina slid it forward. "Good morning," Gina said softly. "I'd like to make a deposit, please." The teller smiled, but her eyes widened slightly at the numbers printed on the check. "Of course, ma'am," she replied after a pause. "May I see your ID?" Gina handed over her license without hesitation. The teller's hands moved across the keyboard, the faint click of keys the only sound between them. Then another figure appeared, a man in a pressed navy suit, silver nameplate pinned sharply to his lapel. "Is there a problem, Angela?" he asked, voice smooth as varnish, but carrying a subtle authority. The teller hesitated. "No problem, Mr. Cartwright. Just a large transaction." Cartwright's eyes, a pale shade of blue that reminded Gina of winter ice, swept over her. "A large transaction indeed." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, may I ask where you obtained this check?" "It's a donation," Gina replied evenly, "from the Norris Foundation. My husband and I manage it." "Norris Foundation?" He said the name as though tasting it. Recognition flickered, then skepticism. "And the purpose of the deposit?" "For our Veterans Center project," she said. "Everything's in order." "Of course," he murmured, still staring at the document as though searching for invisible flaws. "Would you mind waiting a moment while we verify?" She nodded, expecting routine verification, but he didn't walk to the back office. He went straight to the phone behind the counter, lifted the receiver, and spoke in low tones. The teller kept typing, though her hands trembled slightly. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted. The young mother stopped rocking her stroller. A security guard adjusted his stance near the door, his attention suddenly fixed on Gina. Minutes passed. Cartwright returned, his smile sharpened. "I'm sorry for the delay, ma'am. We're just confirming some details." Gina folded her hands atop the counter, remaining patient, though something cold began to settle in her chest. "Take your time," she said quietly. Another 5 minutes. Then 10. The guard's radio crackled. 2 uniformed police officers entered through the glass doors, their boots striking the floor in unison. Every head in the lobby turned. Cartwright gestured toward them, voice calm, rehearsed. "Gentlemen, this is the customer in question." Gina's stomach tightened. "Excuse me?" "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his hand already hovering near his belt. "We've received a report of a suspicious financial transaction. We'll need you to step away from the counter." "That's ridiculous," she replied. "There's nothing suspicious about—" "Step away from the counter," he repeated, sharper this time. The teller looked as if she wanted to speak but said nothing. People began to pull out phones. The mother with the stroller clutched her child closer. The elderly man by the writing stand murmured something to his wife. The world seemed to shrink around Gina, air thickening with unease. She stepped back slowly, trying to stay calm. "Officers, there must be a mistake. The check is legitimate. You can verify it with the foundation. Hands where I can see them." She froze, confusion flashing into disbelief. "I beg your pardon?" The officer nearest to her, his name tag read. Harlan grabbed her wrist. Pain shot up her arm. "You're being detained for questioning. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "I'm not resisting," she said quickly, her voice shaking more from shock than fear. The second officer, a younger man with a thin scar near his jawline, moved behind her. Cold metal snapped around her wrists. The sound of the cuffs echoed across the marble like a gavel striking. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Is that Chuck Norris's wife?" Someone else shushed them. Her knees buckled under the force pushing her down. The marble floor pressed against her skin, hard and unyielding. Harlan's voice loomed above her. "Stay down. I haven't done anything wrong." "Then you've got nothing to worry about." The words cut deeper than the pressure of the cuffs. She stared at the reflection of herself in the polished floor, hair disheveled, face pale, surrounded by strangers filming her humiliation. The check envelope lay crumpled near her purse. One of the officers nudged it with his boot, then picked it up, inspecting the contents. "Big number for a forged document," he muttered. "It's not forged," Gina whispered, her throat dry. Cartwright stood a few feet away, arms crossed, a mask of professional detachment on his face. "We have strict protocols," he announced to no one in particular, as if justifying the scene. "Large transactions of questionable origin must be verified, for everyone's protection." "For your protection," she murmured bitterly. "Quiet," Harlan snapped. He hauled her to her feet, gripping her arm so tightly she winced. "You're coming with us." The other officer guided her toward the door, his hand firm on her shoulder. Phones followed her every step. The flash of a camera burned her vision white for a moment. Outside, sunlight blazed against the bank's glass facade, too bright after the chill of the lobby. The officers led her to the patrol car, parked by the curb. The metal of the cuffs bit deeper each time she moved. She tried to steady her breathing, to remind herself that she had done nothing wrong, that this would be resolved quickly once they checked the Foundation's records. Yet beneath that fragile logic, a raw ache pulsed, an ache of betrayal, of being treated not as a citizen but as a suspect, her integrity reduced to a formality. As they reached the car, a low rumble drew her attention down the street. A silver pickup truck slowed near the intersection. She knew that engine's sound, the rhythm of its idle, the way the sunlight gleamed off the hood. Her heart jumped. The officers hadn't noticed yet. They opened the patrol car door, pushing her gently but firmly toward the seat. She caught a glimpse of herself reflected in the car's window, hands bound, face flushed, eyes wide with disbelief. The truck turned into the lot, stopping abruptly at the sight of flashing lights. The driver's door opened. Chuck Norris stepped out, calm and steady as the horizon itself. The crowd seemed to recognize him all at once. Murmurs rippled, phones lifted higher. The officers stiffened instinctively. Chuck's gaze swept across the scene. The patrol car, the officers, and finally his wife. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and something silent but unmistakable passed between them. "Sir, you need to stay back," Harlan called, hand moving automatically toward his belt. Chuck didn't speak. He walked forward, each step deliberate, controlled, the measured rhythm of a man who had faced worse than intimidation. His presence seemed to alter gravity itself. The chatter died, replaced by a hum of collective anticipation. "Sir, I said stay." Before the officer could finish, Chuck stopped 2 feet away, his expression unreadable. "What's happening here?" "She's under investigation for presenting a fraudulent check," the younger officer said, his voice faltering slightly. Chuck's eyes moved to the crumpled envelope in Harlan's hand. "That's my foundation's check," he said quietly, "and you're making a mistake." "Sir, please step aside," Harlan insisted, but his tone had lost its edge. "Take those cuffs off my wife." The words were soft, but they carried more weight than any shout. Harlan hesitated, eyes darting toward Cartwright, who stood frozen near the doors. The teller, Angela, bit her lip, eyes wide. "Now," Chuck said. Harlan reached for the key. The metallic click echoed again, this time like the closing of a wound. Gina's hands trembled as she lowered them, rubbing the red marks circling her wrists. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that holds 1,000 unspoken questions. Chuck placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "It's over," he murmured, but both of them knew it wasn't. Not yet. As they walked back toward his truck, Gina heard someone whisper behind her, "They'll be on the news tonight." She didn't turn around. She didn't want to see their faces, those same faces that had watched her humiliation like a show. She focused instead on the horizon beyond the parking lot, where the Texas sky stretched wide and mercilessly blue. Inside the truck, the smell of leather and motor oil felt grounding. Chuck started the engine without a word. The first few miles passed in silence, broken only by the hum of tires on asphalt. "They said the check was fake," she whispered finally. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "They'll regret saying that." His voice was calm, almost too calm. Years of discipline kept it that way, but she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from sun-baked metal. "They had no reason," she continued. "I told them about the foundation, about the center. They didn't listen. They never even checked." Chuck's jaw clenched. They saw what they wanted to see. A few minutes later, as the ranch came into view, Gina exhaled shakily. The humiliation still pulsed beneath her skin, an ache that logic couldn't soothe. She imagined the videos already spreading online, strangers judging her by a few seconds of footage. As Chuck parked, he turned to her, his eyes steady. "This isn't the end, Gina." "I know," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He reached over, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and for the first time since the arrest, she saw something in his expression, not rage, not vengeance, but a deep, unwavering resolve. When they stepped inside, the note she'd left that morning still sat on the counter, back before lunch. She looked at it for a long moment, realizing that between sunrise and sunset, the world had shifted beneath their feet. Outside, the sun was still bright, but its warmth no longer comforted. It glared, sharp and merciless, across the fields. Somewhere inside her, humiliation began to harden into purpose. And somewhere inside him, quiet as a drawn breath, purpose began to sharpen into action. Neither spoke as they sat at the table, the untouched coffee now cold. Both knew that what had happened in that bank was bigger than a single insult, bigger than a single woman's dignity. It was a wound that bled into the heart of the system they had always believed in. And Chuck Norris, the man the world thought of as indestructible, looked at his wife's bruised wrists and realized that strength would have to mean something new now. The long road toward justice had begun. The next morning came without comfort. The light over the Norris ranch seemed duller. Its warmth filtered through a haze of unease that hadn't lifted since the day before. Gina woke before sunrise, but instead of peace, she felt a restless energy beneath her skin, like the echo of something unresolved. Every movement of her hands brought back the sting of the handcuffs, the rough pressure against her wrists. The marks had already begun to fade, but the memory of the marble floor, the whispering crowd, and the cold eyes of that bank manager clung to her like dust. Chuck had barely slept. He'd stayed up in his study until dawn, the faint glow of the desk lamp spilling over old photos and documents from his years of service. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. He wasn't a man who let anger control him. Decades of martial discipline had trained him otherwise. But now that discipline felt like a thin dam holding back a rising flood. When Gina came downstairs, he was already at the kitchen table, reading through a small stack of printed news articles. Her arrest had made the local news. Several cell phone videos had been posted online. In one, she was on her knees, hands bound, while an officer shouted orders. The title beneath the video read, "Bank Fraud or Profiling. Lone Star Savings Incident Goes Viral." She stopped behind him, staring over his shoulder at the frozen image on the screen. "They're calling it an incident," she said softly, "like it's some kind of misunderstanding." Chuck looked up. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "It's not a misunderstanding when people choose to humiliate someone," he said. "That was deliberate, calculated." Gina sat opposite him, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her mug. "I didn't even raise my voice, Chuck. I tried to explain, but they didn't care. They'd already decided what I was." "I know," he replied, his voice steady, "and that's why we're not letting it go." He spoke the words like a promise, not a threat. His tone carried no fury, just a quiet certainty that the truth, once uncovered, would be unavoidable. By mid-morning, the phone began ringing, first their son Eric, then reporters, then a lawyer from a veterans association offering support. Gina refused to speak to the media. She didn't want her pain turned into a headline. Eric arrived before noon, his expression a mirror of his father's, calm on the surface but with a storm moving beneath. He had printed out screenshots of bank statements and copies of the foundation's verification papers. "I've already checked with the accountant," he said, spreading them across the table. "The donation check cleared from our verified fund. There's no reason for them to question its legitimacy, unless they were trying to hide something." Chuck studied the papers, tracing a finger along the lines of numbers. "That's exactly what we're going to find out." The ranch was quiet around them, but the air hummed with an invisible tension. Outside, the horses stirred in the corral, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried over the fields. Inside, the family sat in a silence that wasn't peace. It was preparation. That afternoon, Chuck drove back into town. He wanted to look the manager in the eye, not as the man people joked about on television or in memes, but as a husband demanding truth. The same bank, the same polished lobby, the same marble floors. Yet everything felt changed. As he entered, conversations faltered. Employees pretended not to look at him, though curiosity burned behind their glances. "Mr. Norris," Cartwright greeted him stiffly, stepping forward from behind his glass office door. "We're, terribly sorry about yesterday's misunderstanding." Chuck regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "You called the police on my wife because she tried to deposit money for veterans," he said. His voice didn't rise, but it carried across the room with the precision of a well-aimed strike. "I want to hear why." The manager's Adam's apple bobbed. "As I explained to the officers, our system flagged the transaction as irregular. There have been cases of fraud," Chuck interrupted. "You didn't even check her ID before calling them. You didn't verify the check. You made a judgment, not a verification." Cartwright's polished composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Norris, I assure you, there was no bias. We follow procedure." "Procedure doesn't involve putting an innocent woman on the floor in front of a crowd," Chuck said. "That's humiliation. You stood there and watched." The silence between them thickened. Cartwright shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the office windows where tellers pretended to work. "I've already spoken with our legal department," the manager said finally, his tone clipped. "We're prepared to issue a formal apology. Beyond that, I can't comment." Chuck leaned slightly forward. "Then I'll comment for you," he said. "You're going to see this again, not from me, but from the people who'll want to know what kind of bank calls the police on a donor to veterans. I've spent my life teaching discipline and respect. Yesterday, your staff forgot both." He turned and walked out, leaving Cartwright standing in the silence he deserved. Outside, the afternoon sun hit his face, and for the first time since the arrest, he allowed himself a deep breath. It didn't ease the anger, but it grounded it. He knew now that this wasn't just about Gina. It was about something larger, something festering behind polished facades and practiced smiles. When he returned home, Eric was waiting with a laptop open to a spreadsheet. "Dad," he said, "there's something weird. I looked into the bank's community fund statements, They've been taking in federal grants for veterans programs, but the disbursements don't match the deposits. There are missing amounts millions over the last 3 years. Chuck frowned, moving behind his son to read. Could be accounting errors, he said. Could be, Eric agreed. Or could be something worse. The same people who froze Mom's deposit are listed as signatories on those accounts. Gina entered quietly, carrying a tray with 3 mugs of tea. Her hands were steadier now, but her eyes were tired. So they stopped me not because of the check itself, but because it might have connected to something they didn't want exposed. That's what it looks like, Eric said. If we can get records from the foundation's end and compare them, we'll know exactly where the money went. Chuck nodded. Then that's what we'll do. But we do it right. No shouting, no public fights. We build a case so tight that they can't twist it. That night, the ranch felt alive with quiet determination. Gina organized papers, Eric compiled files, and Chuck made calls to old friends, former officers, veterans, and one retired FBI agent he trusted implicitly. He didn't tell them everything, only that he suspected misuse of veteran funds connected to Lone Star Savings. Each conversation ended with the same calm promise: we'll look into it. As darkness settled over the ranch, Gina stepped onto the porch. The sky stretched endlessly above her, scattered with the faint shimmer of stars. She heard the soft whicker of horses and the faint hum of crickets. For a moment, the world seemed at peace again. Then she caught sight of a pair of headlights parked down the road, motionless, their beams dimmed but still visible through the trees. "Chuck," she called softly. He joined her a moment later, following her gaze. The car didn't move. After a few minutes, it turned off its lights, blending into the shadows. "They're watching," Gina whispered. "Let them," Chuck said quietly. "We have nothing to hide." Inside, Eric was still working. He'd discovered that one of the bank's largest veteran outreach funds was registered under a shell organization that had no address other than a rented post office box. The same company had received contracts from a local prosecutor's office, the same office that had approved the bank's community projects. Chuck stood behind him, reading each line. "We're going to need proof," he said. "I'll get it," Eric replied. "And when we do, we'll make sure it can't disappear." By midnight, the family gathered again at the table. Papers spread like a map of corruption. The glow from the overhead lamp threw long shadows across their faces. Gina reached out, placing her hand over Chuck's. "I don't want this to turn into revenge," she said quietly. "I just want them to know they can't treat people this way." Chuck met her eyes. "It's not revenge," he said. "It's accountability. There's a difference." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the old wall clock. Then Eric spoke, his tone steady but grim. "If they've been laundering money through veterans programs, this goes deeper than one bank manager. There'll be more names, more people protecting it. Then we go layer by layer," Chuck said, "one truth at a time." When the meeting ended, he walked outside again, needing air. The night was cool and the wind moved through the grass like a quiet voice. He looked toward the horizon, where the faint outline of town glimmered. Somewhere in those streets were the men who'd humiliated his wife, who'd treated her integrity like a crime. But they'd also made a mistake. They'd brought the fight to someone who didn't back down when things turned ugly. Inside, Gina turned off the lamp, leaving only the faint glow of the moonlight through the window. She looked at the documents spread across the table, the quiet testimony of greed and arrogance, and realized that their ordeal had become something bigger than personal pain. It had become a test of principle. The next morning, Chuck was awake before the sun. He stood by the barn stretching, breathing deeply, centering himself the way he had done every morning since his military days. Eric joined him, their movements synchronized without words. Each motion, each breath carried the same silent purpose: preparation. As they trained, Gina watched from the porch. The rhythm of their practice reminded her that discipline wasn't only about combat, it was about focus, patience, and clarity. She could feel those same qualities taking root inside her now, replacing humiliation with resolve. When the session ended, Chuck looked toward her, wiping sweat from his brow. "They think we'll let it go," he said. "They don't know us," she replied. He smiled faintly. They will. The wind rose, carrying the scent of dry earth and coming rain. Beyond the horizon, the town shimmered in the morning light, its calm hiding the storm they were about to bring. Gina turned back toward the house, her heart steady for the first time since the arrest. She didn't yet know how deep the corruption ran, or how dangerous their pursuit of truth might become. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The men who had humiliated her would never again see her on her knees. The Norris family was moving, quietly and deliberately, toward the truth, and the truth was already beginning to tremble. Rain came that evening, sudden and cleansing, rolling across the plains like a moving wall of silver. The fields around the Norris ranch drank greedily, the dry soil softening under the weight of water. Inside, however, the air remained heavy. Every sound, the tapping of drops against the roof, the occasional creak of the house seemed amplified by tension. Gina stood by the window, watching the rain trace trembling paths down the glass, her reflection faint but weary. She had barely spoken since morning. The humiliation from the bank had turned into something sharper now, something like quiet defiance. But still, there were moments when the memory cut through her calm, leaving her hollow. Behind her, Chuck sat at the table, flipping through a folder of printed bank reports that Eric had gathered. His reading glasses rested halfway down his nose, and a faint furrow lined his forehead. Eric was across from him, the glow from his laptop washing his face in pale blue light. The soft clicking of keys was the only rhythm in the room until Gina finally turned away from the window. "Has anyone from the bank reached out?" she asked, her voice low. Chuck didn't look up. "Cartwright sent an email through a lawyer this morning," he said. "He called it an official apology." "That's not an apology," Eric muttered without raising his eyes. "That's them trying to close the door before we open it." Gina crossed the room, glancing at the open files. "And did you find anything?" Eric leaned back, exhaling. "Enough to know something's off, but not enough to prove it yet. The bank's Veterans Fund records don't add up. There are transfers to multiple nonprofit accounts that don't exist in the registry. It's as if the money disappeared into thin air." Chuck looked up then, eyes narrowing. "Names? Some. There's a signature H, Cartwright on all the forms, but there's also an authorization line from the district attorney's office. Same initials on every major transaction over $100,000. Gina frowned. "You mean someone in the prosecutor's office is involved?" Eric nodded. "If not directly, then by looking the other way." The rain grew harder outside, wind pressing against the windows as if trying to listen. Chuck closed the folder and stood. "We'll need someone who knows how to get those records without triggering alarms." "I might know someone," Eric said. "A friend from my stunt coordination days. He does cybersecurity for the military now. He owes me a favor." "Call him," Chuck said simply. Gina moved toward the kitchen, her movements slow but deliberate. She poured tea for each of them, the steam rising between their words. "I still can't believe this started with a simple deposit," she murmured. "All we wanted was to help veterans." Chuck's expression softened as he took the cup. "Sometimes the smallest things reveal the biggest cracks," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong, Gina. You just walked into the wrong building at the right time." She gave a faint, sad smile. Or the right building at the wrong time. Hours passed with the rain. They spread papers across the dining table, filling it with numbers, annotations, and half-legible signatures. Each document seemed like a fragment of something much larger, a web of deceit that extended far beyond the bank's glass doors. The deeper they looked, the more the picture sharpened. A string of grants meant for veterans' housing programs, quietly rerouted through shell organizations. Donations disappearing before reaching their recipients. Withdrawals approved under the guise of administrative expenses. By midnight, the storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle silence. Eric shut the laptop, rubbing his eyes. "There's enough here to make noise, but we'll need proof of intent," he said. "Otherwise, they'll just call it accounting errors." "We'll get it," Chuck replied. "Tomorrow we start asking questions." "Questions to whom?" Gina asked. "To people who've been silenced," he said. "Veterans who applied for help and never got it. Contractors who built nothing but got paid anyway. Someone will talk. They always do." The next day they drove into town together. The sky was washed clean, bright and deceptively innocent. They started with the Veterans Association office. The building was small, tucked between a barbershop and a pawn store. Inside, an older man named Henry Thin, gray-bearded, wearing a faded Marine Corps cap, sat behind a desk piled high with folders. "I remember your wife," he said when Chuck introduced himself. "That whole mess at Lone Star Savings, damn shame. My daughter showed me the video. Couldn't believe it." "We're not here for sympathy," Chuck said gently. "We're here for information." Henry's eyes narrowed. "Information about what?" "Grants," Eric said, stepping forward. "Your office should have received a donation from the Lone Star Veterans Fund last quarter. Did you?" Henry reached for a drawer, pulled out a ledger. "We got a check for $25,000. That was supposed to cover facility repairs. Never cleared. Bounced twice." Eric exchanged a look with his father. "That check came from the same fund that's been moving hundreds of thousands through fake nonprofits," he said quietly. Henry slammed the ledger shut. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "I've been fighting with their accounting for months. Every time I call, they tell me to wait for the next cycle. Next cycle never comes." Gina took a deep breath. "Henry, would you be willing to make a statement if it comes to that?" He hesitated. "You're talking about powerful people, ma'am, the kind that can ruin you before breakfast." "Then maybe it's time someone ruined them first," Chuck said. Henry studied him, then nodded slowly. "You're not the type to bluff. Fine, I'll help." By the time they left the office, the sun was high, the heat already drawing steam from the wet pavement. Eric opened his phone and called his contact, a man named Mason who specialized in digital forensics. Within an hour, Mason agreed to meet them at a cafe outside the city. He arrived wearing sunglasses and a military jacket, laptop bag slung across his shoulder. "Eric, you sure know how to drag me into trouble," he said, half smiling. "Let me guess, bank fraud, local corruption, missing money?" "All of the above," Eric replied. Mason set up his computer on the table, connecting to a secured hotspot. "Give me what you got." They watched as he typed rapidly, lines of code reflecting in his glasses. Within minutes, he accessed a network of public filings linked to the Lone Star Savings System. "You're right," he muttered. "This isn't just sloppy bookkeeping. They've been laundering funds through at least 6 shell accounts. The paper trail leads to a holding company registered under a guy named Marvin L. Marbury." "Marbury?" Chuck repeated. The name sounded familiar. Mason nodded. "District attorney for the county. He's the one signing off on the bank's financial audits." Gina's hands tightened around her cup. "So the people supposed to enforce the law are protecting the ones breaking it." "Exactly," Mason said. "And they're doing it under the banner of veteran welfare. It's clever. No one questions money that's supposed to help soldiers." Chuck leaned back, eyes narrowing in thought. "We need evidence that can stand in court," he said. "Something undeniable." Mason smiled faintly. "Lucky for you, their digital security is about as strong as wet paper. Give me 48 hours. That night, the ranch was alive with quiet conversation. Gina sat by the fire, sorting through physical documents while Eric and Mason worked side by side at the kitchen table. The clicking of keys filled the air again, a rhythmic pulse of purpose. Chuck paced the room, mind racing. At one point, Gina looked up and said softly, "You think they'll come after us?" He stopped, meeting her gaze. "They already have, but now we're watching back." The next morning, Mason brought results. He laid out a printed report filled with transaction IDs, wire routes, and timestamps. "These accounts were used to funnel money out of federal grants," he explained. "And here's the smoking gun. This signature right here, it's Marbury's. The same signature appears on a transfer authorization to an offshore account." Chuck studied the paper silently. Gina moved closer, reading over his shoulder. The weight of it sank in, a network of deceit tied directly to the people who had orchestrated her humiliation. Eric looked at his father. "What do we do now?" Chuck folded the paper carefully. "Now we prepare," he said. "We're not just dealing with criminals. We're dealing with officials who think they're untouchable. If we move too soon, they'll bury us under procedure. If we move too late, they'll erase the evidence." "So we time it right," Eric said. "Exactly." Over the next few days, they began building their case piece by piece. Gina reached out to veterans who had applied for aid and been rejected. Many told similar stories: endless delays, vanished funds, dismissive replies. Each conversation added another voice to the growing chorus of injustice. One evening, as Gina sat on the porch making calls, she noticed a car idling again near the property line. The same dark sedan as before. She hung up and called into the house. "Chuck, it's here again." He came out, wiping his hands on a towel. The car's engine revved and rolled away slowly. He watched it until it disappeared over the hill. "They're nervous," he said. "That means we're close." Gina shivered, though the air was warm. "What if they try to stop us?" He turned to her, his face calm but resolute. "Then they'll learn what it means to stand against truth." In the days that followed, Mason uncovered more. Phone records linking Cartwright and Marbury, internal memos referencing veteran fund adjustments, even a list of whistleblowers who had been quietly transferred or silenced. It was a pattern, a machine built on intimidation. The Norris house transformed into a command center. The walls were lined with notes and printouts. Late at night, when everyone else was asleep, Chuck often sat alone, reading the statements again and again. He could still see Gina's face from that day at the bank, pale, frightened, humiliated. That image had burned itself into him, not as rage but as duty. One evening, Eric walked in quietly. "Dad," he said, "I know this isn't easy for you, but you've done this kind of thing before. Different field, same principles. You always said the fight for justice isn't about winning. It's about not letting wrong stand unchallenged." Chuck smiled faintly. "Sounds like something your old man would say." "It is," Eric replied. "And this time, we're all in it together." By the end of the week, Mason delivered a final folder. Inside were printouts of emails between Marbury's office and the bank, detailing coordinated delays on legitimate veteran payments. Each message was stamped, time-coded, irrefutable. Gina looked at the papers, then at her husband. "So now we have everything?" "Everything we need to show the world what they've been doing," he said. "But we'll do it our way, on our terms." That night, as they stood together on the porch under a sky clear of clouds, the air was still and electric. Fireflies flickered over the wet grass, silent witnesses to what was coming. Gina rested her head on Chuck's shoulder. "It's strange," she whispered. "I feel like something broke inside me that day. But maybe it had to break, so something stronger could take its place." He nodded slowly. "They tried to humiliate you, Gina. Instead, they woke you up. And they woke me too." The wind stirred the trees. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbled again, low and patient, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The rain would return soon, but this time, it would not wash anything away. It would reveal everything buried beneath the surface. The week that followed settled over the Norris ranch like the uneasy quiet that drifts between lightning and thunder. Outside, the fields shimmered in the Texas heat, the air thick with the hum of cicadas, yet inside the house, every movement carried intent. The kitchen table that once held breakfast plates and folded newspapers had transformed into a command center, covered with printed emails, transaction logs, and sticky notes mapping out a growing conspiracy that reached from the small-town bank all the way to the county prosecutor's office. Gina moved carefully between stacks of paper, her once calm hands now precise and purposeful. The tremor that had followed her arrest was gone. In its place was something quieter, deeper, a resolve forged in humiliation and honed by love. The sound of typing came from the corner where Eric worked beside Mason. Both of them bent over their laptops, the blue glow of screens painting their faces in artificial twilight, even in the brightness of day. Chuck paced slowly near the window, arms folded, eyes scanning the horizon as though expecting the next move to come, not from his family, but from the world beyond the ranch gate. Every evening since Mason's discovery, the same black sedan had returned to park along the distant fence line. Sometimes it stayed for an hour, sometimes just a few minutes. It never came closer, but its message was clear. "We see you." Chuck made a point of standing on the porch whenever it appeared, never saying a word, never looking away until the car left. If they wanted intimidation, they would get endurance instead. Inside, the atmosphere was that of a family preparing for war, though no one said it out loud. They spoke softly, moved deliberately, avoided panic. It was as if the entire household was following the same unspoken rhythm, a rhythm that Gina realized she recognized from the stories Chuck used to tell about his time in the military. The waiting, the planning, the quiet before the first strike. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Eric leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "I've cross-referenced everything," he said. "The numbers don't just point to laundering, they scream it. The veterans' funds, the fake nonprofits, the DA's shell companies, they're all connected through one payment chain. It's elegant in the worst way possible." Mason nodded grimly, and the DA, Marbury, made sure it all stayed invisible by authorizing audits that never happened. The banks board gets their share, the police get their protection, and the people who actually need the help, well, they're too broke or broken to fight back. Gina set down her pen, her brow furrowed. And how many people like Henry have been ignored because of this? "Dozens," Eric replied. "Maybe more. I've found at least 40 rejected grant applications, all with identical language pending verification. It's a script, not a system." Chuck spoke quietly, almost to himself. "They built a fortress of lies and hid behind bureaucracy, but fortresses fall from the inside." Mason looked up. "What's the plan then? We have enough data to blow this open. But if we go public now, they'll deny everything and smear you in the process. They've done it before." Chuck's voice was steady, but his gaze hardened. "We're not going to the press yet, not until we've gathered people witnesses who can speak for themselves. If this becomes about me or Gina, they'll twist it into personal revenge. It has to be bigger than that." Gina listened, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "We could call the veterans community," she said. "The ones who never got their aid. They'll come if we give them a reason." Eric's eyes lit up. "A town meeting," he said. "Not in a courthouse or a government building. Somewhere public, open, where cameras can't be turned off." "Exactly," Chuck said. "We'll invite the press ourselves, but only after we've made it impossible for them to silence the story. They've relied on secrecy. We'll give them sunlight." The decision once made changed everything. The days that followed became a flurry of preparation. Gina coordinated phone calls with local veterans groups, church networks, and community leaders, explaining only that there would be a gathering to discuss misused veteran funds. She didn't mention names, didn't accuse anyone outright. The truth would speak for itself when the time came. Eric and Mason worked around the clock to create a digital archive, a secure cloud system that mirrored every document, every recording, every email they had uncovered. "If they try to wipe us out, they'll only expose themselves faster," Mason said. "Once the files go live, they can't take them back." One evening, Gina was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard a soft knock at the back door. It was Henry, the veteran who had agreed to help. His hat was in his hands and his eyes were wary. "Ma'am," he said, glancing around before stepping inside. "I got your message. I'll be there for the meeting. But I thought you should know someone came by the office today asking about me. Said they were from the county records department, but I didn't buy it. They knew too much about my finances." Chuck appeared in the doorway. "Did you get a name?" Henry shook his head. "No badge, no business card. Just a warning to stay out of politics." "They're tightening their grip," Eric said from the other room. Chuck put a hand on Henry's shoulder. "You did the right thing coming here. Keep your head down until the meeting. We'll handle the rest." Henry nodded, his voice quiet. "They're scared, Mr. Norris. You can see it in how they move. People that's sure of their power don't act like that unless they know it's slipping." After Henry left, Gina sank into a chair, exhausted. "How far will they go, Chuck?" she asked. "If they're willing to threaten veterans, they'll go as far as they think they can get away with," he said. "That's why we make sure they can't." That night, the house didn't sleep. Eric drafted a schedule for the upcoming meeting. Gina wrote a statement to open the event, and Chuck called every trustworthy contact he still had from his law enforcement connections. Some were reluctant to speak, others silently grateful that someone was finally doing something. By midnight, rain began again. Soft at first, then harder, tapping at the windows like fingers. The storm outside felt like an omen, but not of doom of cleansing. Gina looked up from her writing and watched the drops race down the glass. "It feels like something's ending," she whispered. Chuck, standing behind her, answered, "Sometimes things have to end before they can be made right." 2 days later, The town began to buzz with quiet rumors. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards and social media posts hinted at a community meeting exposing veteran fund fraud. Marbury's office dismissed it as baseless online chatter. But the unease spread. The bank tightened its security protocols, and an unmarked patrol car began circling near the Norris property. On the morning before the meeting, Gina woke early and went outside. The air was cool, the dawn pink and fragile. She walked across the damp grass, listening to the distant lowing of cattle, the hum of cicadas slowly waking. For a moment she felt the weight of everything they had uncovered pressing against her shoulders. But there was also pride, a quiet, immovable pride that came from knowing she had refused to stay silent. Inside, Eric was on the phone, finalizing the technical setup. Mason had arranged for live broadcasting. Multiple cameras would stream the event simultaneously across different platforms to prevent interference. "They can't block all of them," he said. "Once it starts, it's out there." Chuck was already dressed, wearing his old denim jacket, the same one he used to wear during his early charity events. It wasn't for show. It was a reminder of where he came from, of the people he was standing up for. As the day stretched toward evening, nerves hummed beneath the calm. They rehearsed every detail, the order of speakers, the placement of cameras, even the seating arrangements to avoid confusion once the press arrived. Jana practiced her opening words again and again, her voice steadying with each repetition. When the sun dipped low, painting the fields in orange and rose, the black sedan appeared again. Only this time, it didn't stay at the fence line. It drove closer, slowly, headlights off, until it stopped at the end of the driveway. Chuck stepped out onto the porch, silent as ever, and watched. The car idled for a long minute. Then the passenger window rolled down, revealing a man in a suit and dark glasses. "Mr. Norris," he called, his voice carrying in the warm air. "You've made quite a stir. My employer would appreciate a word." Chuck didn't move. "Tell your employer he can have all the words he wants tomorrow night publicly." The man's jaw tightened. "That's not how this works." "It is now," Chuck said. The man hesitated, then the window rolled up, and the car pulled away into the growing dusk. When Chuck came back inside, Gina was waiting. "Who was it?" "Someone sent to test our fear," he said. "They didn't find any." The house was silent after that, but not with dread, more like focus. Every heartbeat in unison, every thought aimed toward what would come next. The table was cleared, the documents packed into neat folders, the speeches finalized. That night before bed, Gina and Chuck sat together on the porch. The crickets sang, and the smell of wet earth rose from the fields. "Do you ever think about how it started?" she asked softly. "Just one morning, one trip to the bank. I thought I was just making a deposit." He looked at her with a faint smile. "Sometimes change starts with something small. You didn't just make a deposit, you pulled the first thread. Now the whole fabric's coming apart." She leaned against him, eyes fixed on the stars emerging above the dark line of trees. "Tomorrow we find out what truth is worth." He placed a hand over hers, his voice quiet and certain. "Everything." The night deepened around them, peaceful yet alive with energy, the same electric stillness that hums through the air before the first strike of thunder. The calm was ending. Somewhere beyond the hills, the storm was already gathering. The morning of the meeting dawned in a muted silvery light, the kind that seemed to flatten the landscape into stillness. The Texas air was heavy, carrying the scent of distant rain and dust, and even the birds were quiet. Gina woke before sunrise, unable to sleep through the restless pulse in her chest. The house was already awake, the hum of activity coming from every room. Eric and Mason were packing the final equipment into the truck: cameras, cables, backup drives, microphones. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Chuck stood by the window, his reflection pale against the faint light. His hands were still, but his mind was moving with soldierly precision. He had planned operations before missions far more dangerous than a town meeting, but this one felt heavier. There was no backup squad, no command to answer to. There was only family, truth, and faith that decency would mean something once the world saw what they had uncovered. Gina walked up behind him, her hand resting on his arm. "You slept even less than I did," she said softly. "I wasn't tired," he replied, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed him. He turned to look at her, and for a moment the lines of resolve on his face softened. "You ready?" She nodded, though her throat tightened. "As I'll ever be. I keep thinking about all the people who'll be there tonight. Some of them have been waiting years for answers." "That's why this matters," Chuck said. "It's not just about us anymore. It never was." Outside, the ranch stretched wide and golden in the early light. The storm from the previous night had cleared, leaving puddles that mirrored the sky. The truck engine roared to life as Eric honked twice from the driveway. Mason sat in the passenger seat, already on a phone call, his voice brisk and confident. They were coordinating with local journalists, those rare few who hadn't sold their integrity for convenience. As they drove toward town, Gina watched the familiar landmarks roll past. The old gas station where she used to buy lemonade for the kids, the school where Eric had once played football, the church whose steeple still stood tall against the horizon. It struck her how ordinary everything looked. Yet beneath that quiet surface lay the weight of injustice that had reached into every corner of the county. By late afternoon, the town square was unrecognizable. The community center, a modest red brick building with a faded flag out front, was surrounded by cars, news vans, and clusters of people carrying signs and cameras. Reporters were already setting up in the lot, adjusting tripods, shouting into microphones. The buzz of electricity in the air was almost tangible. Gina felt her pulse quicken as they stepped out of the truck. She had faced humiliation before a crowd, but this time she would face them on her own terms. The whispers followed them immediately, people pointing, murmuring her name, recalling the video that had started it all. But there was something different in the way they looked at her now. Not pity, not mockery, respect. Inside, volunteers were arranging chairs in rows. Veterans in worn jackets with unit patches stood near the back, their faces solemn. Some nodded in recognition when they saw Chuck. Others approached quietly, shaking his hand without words. Each handshake carried a silent thank you, a recognition of shared experience and quiet endurance. Eric and Mason hurried to the stage, setting up the laptop and projectors. Chuck checked his watch. "We'll start in 15, he said, his tone even. "Once the cameras are rolling, there's no turning back." Gina took a deep breath, her eyes sweeping the room. The sight of so many people, some angry, some hopeful, filled her with a strange mixture of strength and dread. She could almost feel the invisible threads connecting every one of them, threads woven by loss, betrayal, and the hope that someone, finally, would speak the truth. When the clock struck 7, the lights dimmed slightly and Eric gave a small nod from the control table. Cameras blinked to life. The red recording lights glowed like eyes watching every movement. Gina stepped forward to the podium, papers trembling slightly in her hands, though her voice when she spoke was clear. "My name is Gina Norris," she began. "Some of you know me because of what happened a few weeks ago. You've seen the video. You've heard the rumors. But what happened that day at the bank was never just about a check or a misunderstanding. It was about something bigger, something rotten that's been growing in this town for years." A murmur rippled through the crowd. She paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "When I tried to deposit money from our foundation into an account meant to help veterans, I was accused of fraud. I was humiliated. But that humiliation uncovered something far more shameful, a system that steals from those who've already given everything." Behind her, the projector flickered on, the screen filled with a spreadsheet columns of numbers, transfer dates, and highlighted account names. Mason's voice came through the microphone, calm and precise. "These are records obtained from the Lone Star Savings Bank. Over 3 years, more than $4 million in federal and private veteran aid funds were redirected through shell organizations. The authorizations were signed by bank officials and confirmed by the district attorney's office." Gasps echoed across the hall. Henry, seated near the front, leaned forward, his jaw tight. Gina glanced at him before continuing. "The men and women sitting here tonight, people like Henry, applied for that aid. They were denied. While they waited for promises that never came, others were lining their pockets." A veteran stood up, voice cracking with anger. "You mean all those letters? All those pending applications? They were lies?" "Yes," Gina said quietly. "They lied to all of you, and they thought no one would notice." Chuck stepped forward then, his presence commanding the room without force. Corruption hides behind the assumption that people are too scared or too small to fight back. But you're not small, and we're not scared. His voice carried through the hall, low and steady. The truth is here now, in your hands and in the eyes of every person watching this live stream. They can't bury it anymore. Mason switched the screen again. This time it showed email chains messages between the DA's office and the bank, full of coded phrases and veiled agreements. All verified, Mason said. Digital signatures, timestamps, everything cross-checked. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, questions overlapping. Mr. Norris, are you accusing the district attorney of financial misconduct? One called. I'm not accusing anyone, Chuck replied calmly. I'm showing you evidence. What you do with it, that's on your conscience. The crowd erupted, voices rising in disbelief, anger, and vindication. Some veterans began clapping, the sound building like distant thunder. Others shouted for justice, for arrests, for answers. Gina felt tears sting her eyes, not of sadness, but of fierce, overwhelming relief. Then amid the uproar, a new sound cut through the sharp echo of footsteps on the wooden floor. The doors at the back opened, and a group of uniformed officers entered, followed by a man in a gray suit. It was Marbury, the district attorney himself. His expression was composed, but his eyes burned with barely contained fury. Mr. Norris, he said, his voice loud enough to carry, I see you've decided to hold a circus. Chuck turned to face him. Only if the guilty perform? Murmurs swept through the crowd. Cameras turned, microphones extended. Marbury adjusted his tie, pretending composure. You're playing a dangerous game, Norris. Leaking confidential documents, spreading falsehoods, these are criminal acts. Then arrest me, Chuck said. Right here, in front of them all. The challenge hung in the air like a blade. For a moment, the entire room froze. Marbury hesitated, glancing toward the cameras, realizing the trap. To act would make him look exactly as corrupt as the files suggested. To retreat would expose his weakness. He chose silence. Chuck stepped closer, his tone quiet but cutting. You had years to do the right thing, to honor the people who served. Instead, you built your fortune on their pain. The law doesn't protect you anymore, Marbury. The people do. Applause broke out again, louder this time, unstoppable. Marbury's face tightened, and he turned sharply, pushing past the officers as he left. The cameras followed him all the way to the door, catching every step of his retreat. For the next hour, testimonies filled the room. Veterans, former bank employees, whistleblowers who had come forward once they saw the broadcast go live. Each story was another crack in the edifice of silence. The press recorded everything. By the time the meeting ended, the town that had once looked the other way was now staring directly into the heart of its own corruption. When the lights came back on, the exhaustion hit like a wave. Gina sat down, trembling, her hands cold despite the heat of the room. Chuck knelt beside her, his voice low. You did it, he said. You told the truth. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. We did it. Outside, night had fallen. The air buzzed with the murmurs of people lingering in the square, talking, debating, recording their thoughts. Somewhere sirens wailed in the distance, not in warning, but as if signaling the beginning of something new. As they walked to the truck, Eric checked his phone. It's already everywhere, he said. National outlets picked it up within minutes. They're calling it the Norris disclosure. Chuck shook his head. Call it whatever they want. What matters is that the right people finally see. Gina looked back once at the glowing windows of the community center, where the truth had finally found its voice. She felt lighter, though she knew this wasn't over. There would be investigations, backlash, maybe even danger. But for the first time since that awful day at the bank, she could breathe without shame. As they drove home, the first drops of rain began to fall again, tapping gently against the windshield. The storm had arrived, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt cleansing, like a benediction. Chuck reached over, taking her hand in his. Neither of them spoke, but both understood the same silent truth. They had faced power, and power had blinked first. The road ahead was uncertain, but the light of justice, fragile, flickering and real, had begun to shine. Morning came slow and uncertain, the kind of gray light that seemed to hover between night and day, as if the world itself wasn't yet sure which direction it wanted to turn. A thin mist clung to the fields around the Norris ranch, softening the lines of the fences and trees. The air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass, carrying the freshness that only follows a storm. Inside the house, the television flickered with news broadcasts, the sound low but insistent, every channel repeating the same name: Lone Star Savings Bank, District Attorney Marvin L. Marbury, and the Norris family. What had begun as one woman's humiliation had become a national scandal. Gina stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. The screen across the room showed footage from the night before, her standing at the podium, her voice clear, Chuck beside her, veterans behind them. Reporters outside the courthouse were now speculating about arrests, investigations, and the possibility of federal involvement. Her name was everywhere, yet she felt no triumph, only a quiet, exhausted clarity. Chuck entered the room, his steps steady but slow. He'd been awake since before dawn, pacing the porch, answering calls from journalists and lawyers, declining interviews with calm politeness. He'd always avoided attention. Fame to him had been an old, ill-fitting coat he wore only when necessary. Now that same attention had become a weapon, one he had no choice but to wield. He poured himself coffee, then glanced toward the television. "They're saying Marbury resigned," he said. Gina looked up, surprised. "Already?" "Effective immediately. He left a statement, claims it's for personal reasons." Chuck's mouth curved into something between disbelief and disappointment. "He'll try to disappear before the storm hits him full force." "He won't get far," Gina said softly. "Not now." Eric came into the room, laptop under his arm, his face lit by the blue glow of constant updates. "You're right," he said. "The Justice Department just opened a preliminary inquiry. It's all over the wire. They've frozen several of the bank's accounts and issued subpoenas for internal records. They're naming Cartwright, the bank's board, and Marbury as persons of interest." Gina sank into a chair, a strange relief washing over her. "It's really happening," Eric nodded. "They'll try to spin it, of course. Some of the talking heads are already saying it's a political move, others that it's all you're doing." Chuck gave a small laugh. "They can say what they want. We didn't do anything except tell the truth." "But truth has enemies," Eric said quietly. Chuck met his son's eyes. "Then it's a good thing truth has family too." For the rest of the morning, the ranch buzzed with phone calls. Friends, journalists, and veterans called in waves, some to offer thanks, others to share stories, many simply to express disbelief that justice might finally be catching up with those who had abused power for so long. Gina listened to the messages, tears welling with every voice that said, "You gave us back our dignity." At noon, a car pulled into the long gravel driveway. Chuck stepped outside before it even stopped. A man in a dark suit emerged, tall, calm, professional. He introduced himself as Special Agent Keller from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. "Mr. Norris, Mrs. Norris," he said, shaking their hands with quiet respect. "I won't take much of your time. We're reviewing the evidence you made public, and I need to verify the original files." "They're all here," Chuck said, leading him inside. Mason, who had stayed the night, was already waiting at the kitchen table with the secured drives and hard copies. Keller examined everything carefully, asking few questions, but taking meticulous notes. He had the steady patience of someone who had seen too many lies and too few truths. Before leaving, he turned to Gina. "I want you to know something, ma'am," he said. "What you did, standing up in public like that, wasn't just brave. It made this investigation possible. Without that exposure, they might have buried this for years." Gina smiled faintly. "I just wanted to stop them from hurting anyone else." "That's usually how justice starts," Keller said, "with someone who just wants it to stop." When he was gone, silence filled the kitchen again. Outside, the clouds began to part, sunlight breaking through in long, golden beams that touched the fields like a benediction. Gina stepped out onto the porch and breathed deeply. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel heavy. By evening, the news reached a fever pitch. Marbury's mansion was surrounded by reporters. His lawyer refused comment. Cartwright was taken into custody under suspicion of wire fraud and conspiracy. There were rumors of others flipping minor officials who had turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency. The system that had once seemed unshakable was crumbling, its own weight pulling it apart. At dinner, Eric read the headlines aloud. Community demands transparency in Veterans Fund scandal. FBI confirms fraud investigation expanding statewide. He grinned for the first time in days. You two just started a chain reaction. Chuck smiled, but it was a tired smile. It's not about starting it. It's about finishing it right. Gina looked at him across the table. You think it's really over? He shook his head. Not yet. There'll be trials, hearings, more lies before the truth finally settles. But it's moving in the right direction. That's enough for now. Later that night, Gina went out again. The stars were sharp against the black sky, and the air had cooled. The ranch was quiet except for the distant sounds of crickets and the rustle of wind through the grass. Chuck joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. For a long moment, they stood without speaking. I keep thinking about that day, she said finally. The floor of that bank, the way everyone watched. I thought that was the end of something, but maybe it was just the beginning. It was, Chuck said softly. Sometimes the worst moments are just the doorway to something better. You walk through it. She leaned against him, the weight of everything that had happened pressing on her, but it no longer felt unbearable. It felt earned. The following week brought even more revelations. More victims came forward. Veterans, widows, small charities that had been denied funds. Each new voice made the picture clearer, the corruption deeper, the justice sharper. The Norris family's name appeared in headlines not as victims, but as catalysts. Gina's image at the podium became a symbol of integrity, a woman who had faced humiliation and turned it into truth. One morning, she received a letter in the mail. The envelope bore no return address, only a simple line typed across the front. For Mrs. Norris. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in a trembling but firm hand. I was one of the officers who arrested you that day. My name is David Harlan. I've resigned from the force. I was following orders that didn't come from the bank, they came from above. I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that watching you stand up to them showed me what real courage looks like. I hope someday I can earn that kind of peace. Gina folded the letter carefully and held it for a long time. When she showed it to Chuck, he said nothing, just placed his hand over hers, his thumb brushing the edge of the paper. There was nothing more to say. By the end of the month, arrests turned into indictments. The courthouse overflowed with reporters. The town that had once turned its gaze away from corruption was now watching every detail unfold. And in that scrutiny, something unexpected bloomed hope. People began to speak of reform, of new leadership, of transparency. For Gina, life slowly began to regain its rhythm. She returned to the Veterans Foundation, where donations now poured in from across the country. The new board of trustees, free from the old corrupt ties, named the first facility in her honor, the Gina Norris Rehabilitation and Integrity Center. She protested the naming at first, embarrassed, but they insisted. It's not just a building, the director told her. It's a reminder that one act of courage can rebuild everything that greed tried to destroy. Chuck watched the dedication ceremony from the back row, his heart full but quiet. He had always believed in strength, not the kind that breaks, but the kind that endures. Watching Gina speak before a crowd of veterans, doctors, and volunteers, he saw that strength reflected in her completely. When she finished her speech, she stepped down from the stage and joined him, smiling. You're awfully quiet, she said. Just proud, he replied. Of me? Of us. As they walked through the new facility afterward, the sound of laughter and conversation echoed through the halls. Veterans were already meeting with counselors, staff moved with purpose, and sunlight poured through wide windows onto clean, bright floors. Every corner of the place seemed alive with what they had fought for dignity restored. That evening, back at the ranch, they sat on the porch once more. The sky stretched wide and endless, painted in gold and violet as the sun sank low. Eric joined them, his camera in hand, recording footage for the Foundation's website. Say something for the donors, he said with a grin. Chuck shook his head. They don't need to hear from me. Gina laughed softly. Then from me, Tell them this place isn't built on money, it's built on what people refuse to ignore. Eric lowered the camera, smiling. That's perfect. As night fell, the world seemed finally to exhale. The darkness that had once loomed over them was gone, replaced by the quiet rhythm of wind and life continuing. The headlines would fade, the trials would come and go, but the truth they'd uncovered had already changed something far greater than a town or a bank. It had changed faith itself. Chuck reached for Gina's hand, their fingers intertwining, their silhouettes framed by the last light of the day. You know, he said softly, they thought they could break us. She looked at him, her eyes shining. They didn't know who they were dealing with. He smiled, and together they watched the first stars pierce the twilight. The world was still imperfect, still scarred, but it was turning toward the light again. And for the first time in a long time, justice felt not like a word spoken in courtrooms, but like a breath in their own lungs, steady, strong, and alive. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't believe what's coming next. Share this video so more people can see the truth.